Continuing to dominate the headlines in England is the news of a consortium led by LA Dodgers past owner Todd Boehly set to lodge a formal offer to buy Chelsea FC in the coming days. It's a developing story as we now welcome in Gab Marcotti and Nedum to talk more about it. Gab, it's hard not to think of the likes of Kroenke and the Glazers, American ownership with multiple sports teams. Is this something that should concern and worry Chelsea fans?
Well, I mean, it depends on the type of owners. I mean, you just mentioned Manchester United and the Glazers, and obviously if you're a United fan, you're not going to be happy with what they did to the club, loading it up with debt. And obviously we've also had a decade of basically shambles since Sir Alex left. But equally, contrast that with what Fenway Sports Group have done at Liverpool, and it's a completely different story. So I don't necessarily think that the idea of owners who've got different clubs in different sports is necessarily a problem. It depends whether they employ the right people. I don't believe you have all these great synergies that people like to talk about. But if you're a good owner, if you listen to your fans, if you're a good steward for the club and you appoint the right people, I don't think it matters if you also own an NFL team or an NBA team.
One thing we have seen, Gab, during Roman Abramovich's time in charge of Chelsea is that during the second half of his time there, Chelsea have been more financially conservative but still manage to have success. With a change in ownership, would this be sustainable?
That's a great question. And in fact, when we look at the amount of money, around about £1.5 billion, close to $2 billion that Abramovich has put into the club in the form of loans rather than equity, but it's still him lending money to himself effectively. I think you'll note that the vast majority of that, certainly as a proportion of revenue, is in the early part of his tenure. Now, part of that has to do with financial fair play, which of course came in 2012. But I think also there is a sense that Chelsea are much more self-sustaining. He took the club, elevated it to a global brand with his investment. Now that hasn't gone away. So I think that bodes well. I don't think the new owner needs to come in and say, well, I'm going to have to spend hundreds of millions a year of my own money the way Abramovich did at the very beginning of his tenure. Obviously, it helps to be liquid. It helps to have deep pockets. And obviously, you have to consider still the after effects of the pandemic. But I think there's a lot of scope for people to work with. And I also don't think that it's 100% necessary that they definitely need a new stadium like Arsenal or Tottenham got. I think that would help, but they've managed to do without it thus far.
Nedum, you've been at a club when there have been ownership changes. Is there any way that this could potentially go sideways?
I think Gab's discussed that very well, to be honest, because, we can look at the Glazers and the like, but then that Fenway Sports Group sort of model at Liverpool, people are happy with their ownership group, they're happy with their football club. So I guess for these guys coming in, it's just a case of, can you get a feel for, what makes the club tick and what the club needs to go forward? But then I think the other interesting side to that is that new ownership coming in, surely you just don't want to do exactly the same as the guy that was there before. There's a lot of, I think there must be some level of sort of like ego within, this is how I want to run the club. And I think that's when the sort of insecurity comes in from players, staff and alike, because you don't know what you've been used to. It could potentially be very, very different going forward. And, in some ways rightly so, because somebody has invested a lot of money into the football club. So whether or not it could go wrong, I don't know. I think wrong essentially is subjective. But I believe that if you're buying into Chelsea Football Club, you have the best interests at heart, because if the club is successful, then you're successful as well. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes and see if the model's the same, because again, the strategic decisions, like how many managers have been there across the years, we can argue and say it's been too many, but then we can't argue about the amount of trophies that they've won in that time, the success that they've had in that time. So it'll be interesting to see what the perspective is of the prospective new owners as they come in, whether they will be as aggressive in terms of finding success as Abramovich was. And, as I say, if Chelsea will be the new Chelsea, or if it's the same old Chelsea, but just a different name at the helm of it.
Well, there'll be a lot more talk on the changes at Chelsea on the latest Gab and Jules podcast. They take a deep dive on the subject. It's available now to download.
Thank Thank you very much for watching ESPN FC on YouTube. For more highlights, analysis, and exclusive content, be sure to subscribe.